just to prep you, so I'm gonna ask you some very basic questions,
Sure.
obviously, for the record. And then when I ask you them, try and include the question
Yep.
and the answer. So where were you born? I was born in,
Gotcha. Like,
much as you can.
fortunately, I've actually been in your position sometimes.
Oh, perfect.
So
Then you know.
I'm glad you brought that up. I
Yeah,
would not
yeah,
remember
yeah,
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
And then let it
Yeah.
go, you know, give
Sure.
detail, attention to detail.
Okay.
And if you think you remember, just say, I'm pretty sure, you know, so that we know it's not, this is gonna be here for 100 years, so we
Yeah.
wanna make sure it's as accurate as we can possibly get it.
Yeah.
You ready? Okay, we're gonna start. Okay, Barry, so here we are. It is Sunday, September 27th, 2015 at Monmouth University. I'd like you to start by basically talking about your early days and your earliest musical memory
Oh, sure.
as it pertains to rock and roll, let's
Oh,
say.
well, I've always loved music, and as much as I really can't remember the first time I really was bitten by it, I do have very fond memories of listening to radio, AM radio, back when I was maybe even 6th grade, 7th grade. I remembered that certain music was really affecting me. When I was a 6th grader, I remember being a big fan of the Shirelles, and I loved R&B music. And I loved listening to the radio stations and what they were playing. And the point came when, as music started to evolve, especially around the time, I would say in the mid-60s, when the British music scene hit, suddenly music became kind of bigger than just the hit songs, the radios. Suddenly, groups like the Beatles, groups like the Rolling Stones, there was more depth to what they did. The concept of listening to a whole album became new. And all of a sudden, it became weird to me that music, for me, and for many people out there, including musicians, was a very rich experience and very much of an artistic endeavor. And I found that with my interest in the arts, I was really, really drawn to music. But when the Beatles hit and that whole music scene hit, everybody in my town was in a band. I couldn't wait to be in a band. I learned the bass guitar, I was in a band, we played, but we tended to play not the pop stuff. We oriented ourselves to more like the blues music. We played some of the scrappier Stone songs, the Animals. We liked having stuff a little bit of an edge to it. And I love music, I love performance. I would go see concerts. My first concert was, I went and saw the Kingsmen. And I just have just incredible memories of just hearing live music for my first time. So I was really engaged with music early on. I think part of it maybe was an influence that there was always music in my house. My father loved music. He was always playing music on the stereo. So I was always around it. When I went to college,
Stop there for a second.
I'm sorry, yeah.
Where did you grow up? What town?
Sure.
Yeah.
I grew up in Newton, Massachusetts, which is a suburb of Boston. And one of the things that was great about growing up there was I was, at the time, a 25-cent trolley ride into town. So I spent a lot of time going into Boston as well. But it was interesting because growing up in my town, when music in the mid-60s started to become really big, there was a lot of local bands, people my same age that were playing in bands. And I decided I really wanted to play in a band too. And by the time the Beatles hit and the whole British invasion hit, everybody wanted to be in a band. So we formed a band and we were very successful. And actually kind of one of my great memories is locally in the Boston region, there really weren't venues to play like there are today, clubs. I mean, basically the big groups would come and play like at the Boston Garden. But outside of that, there was a few local venues. There was one that was called the Surf Nantasket, which is where a lot of local bands that suddenly got big enough maybe to do a record would appear. Well, my band played really hard and practiced a lot. By the time we were seniors in high school, we were pretty good. We actually got a chance to play at the Surf Nantasket. And one of my biggest memories is going there one night to see another band play before we went there. And it was a band that actually just got off the road with playing with the Beatles. A local band that was called the Ramrods. And they had just come back from playing with the Beatles in San Francisco. And this was summer of '66. And they came back and they said, there's this new music happening out in San Francisco. It's called psychedelic. We're going to give you a little taste of it. All I know was the lights went down, the flashing lights came on, feedback, neon, strobe lights. I was psychedelicized. And I brought that music back to my band. I said, we've got to play some of this stuff. So we started to play this type of edgy music back then, and suddenly there was this thing happening with us in the audience that I had never seen before, and I really was experiencing the power of playing live music. So, in a sense, that's about as far as my personal music dream, but always wanting to be in some sort of a creative form. What I did is, as I went into college, I decided to take some of this love for music and utilize somewhere. And so when I was first a student in Temple University in Philadelphia, I became a disc jockey. And as a result of being a disc jockey, I could attend some of the local concerts. I could interview some of the local groups. So basically in the late 60s, I was on the air, but I was going down to, there was a very well-known venue in Philadelphia at the time called Electric Factory. And I would go there almost on a weekly basis. I was kind of had this open invitation. I was always on the guest list. But I was interviewing acts like Rod Stewart, the Grateful Dead, Buddy Guy, and I just was continually getting immersed in music. So in a lot of ways, my love of music really was very much had blossomed, or was growing dynamically much more before I actually eventually got into photography.
What high school did you go to, and what were the years that you were there? When did you graduate?
Sure. I went to Newton South High School.
Newton South High School?
Right. And I graduated from Newton South High School in 1967.
Okay, and then in fall of 67, you go to Temple?
Yes.
And you're there until what, 71?
I'll tell you the story,
All right.
for what it's worth. I went to Temple University in 1967.
Right.
And honestly, at that time, I went to college because that's what you did after high school. I went to Temple because I think I applied to 5 schools, got into 2, Temple was one of them. And I went there to become a communications major. I had an interest in filmmaking, and I decided to enroll in the communications program. Around 1967, there was also a great upheaval in the youth culture. Right. The whole protest movement was evolving. The whole experimental movement was evolving. And I personally got really into that and really found it. And I was more interested in the extracurricular activities than my curricular activities, to the point that when I returned to school in my sophomore year for my spring semester, I received a letter from the dean to come see him. I did not know, and I went to see the dean, and the dean sat me down, and I remember he looked at me, and he said, we decided to dismiss you from school. And I said, well, why is that? Well, your grades have suffered, and we don't see any way that you can perhaps bring them back up. And I said, well, isn't the policy here to give somebody a semester of academic probation? And I think he knew that I had been sort of active politically in the school. And this was shortly after the Columbia takeover and all that. And we had our own little issues there. I remember him, this is a vivid memory I have, he took his file folder, he folded it, took a deep sigh, looked at me and said, Barry, students like you, we discouraged from continuing their studies at Temple University. I said, okay, so I was kind of blown away by this, and I decided that my first thing was, how am I going to tell my parents? Right. So I said, well, is there anything I can do to get back into school? He says, all right, if you see your professors that know you, and you get a note from them saying they believe you can pull your grades up, we'll let you in. So I spent the first 2 weeks of the semester going to all my past professors, getting notes saying I could get back in, and they admitted me back into school. And what happened was, I went to my first class, 3 weeks into the semester, it was a geology class. I sat up in the back of the room, I put my feet up over the chair in front of me, there were these big, massive lecture halls. I looked around and I basically said, all these kids are here because they're working their asses off. I knew I wasn't gonna be able to make it academically. I just said, and I just BS my way back in. And I quit school 2 weeks later.
Is that
right? I just said, this doesn't feel right to me. So I went back to Boston, kind of, regrouped myself, and was talking to some friends, told them I was really interested in filmmaking and fine arts. And someone suggested, you ought to really consider Emerson College. Right. So I took a couple of classes that summer just to make up for some lost credits, applied to Emerson, got into Emerson in the fall of '69, and decided that this was really going to work for me. And the interesting thing about it was, now I wanted to go to school. That was my choice. Now I had a curriculum I was interested in. And I went from like a near failing student to literally an A and B student. Not to mention that the summer before that I attended Woodstock, so that was fun as well,
So you graduated in 73?
I graduated in 72.
72.
I graduated in the fall of 72,
okay.
yeah.
Graduated in 72.
Yeah.
Okay, so now, if the stage is set where you are you living in Boston now?
Yes, I am, yeah.
So you're living in Boston, how are you making your living, or are you just going to school full-time?
Well, I'm going to school full-time, but I'm also working for the school, and I was working in the film department. And one of the things I would do is I would do two things. We would have film projects, so I would be in charge of signing out the film equipment, to all the different students so they could do the projects. The other thing also that I was doing was I was the projectionist, so I would work and do all the films. And I probably have seen Grapes of Wrath more than anybody, I can tell you that right now. But the other thing that I did, which was interesting, is I became a roadie for a group. And because my love of music just kept,
Are you still playing bass at the time?
I'm not playing bass anymore, but what's
You're still in the music culture,
I'm
though.
still in music culture, and I'm still just somehow, it wasn't like I sought out other members of the music business. It was just that I knew people that were musicians, and I just met them. I can't remember how. And so I met some musicians, and they had a band, and there was this interesting, and you won't know about, there was this phenomenon that happened in Boston a few years after the San Francisco movement. When the San Francisco music scene hit, and the record labels grabbed the axe, and Big Brother, the Dead, Quicksilver, the rest of them, and they saw this opportunity as in the youth culture, somehow MGM Records decided they wanted to do it as well. They went to Boston, they signed 3 bands in Boston, and they decided to create this thing called the Boston Sound. And there was 3 bands, it was Ultimate Spinach, Beacon Street Union, and Orpheus. I lived next door to Harry Sandler, who was a drummer for Orpheus. I knew Wayne Ulecki, who was the bass player for Beacon Street Union, and I got to know a couple of members of Ultimate Spinach, ended up being a roadie with them. And I got to know their manager and a lot of their people real well. That band broke up. Ian Bruce Douglas, who was the leader of the band, formed a new group, and I and a friend of mine became the roadies. And I was doing that while I was finishing college at the same time. So I sort of had, it was more like they were doing local gigs, or if they did a gig over the weekend, I would go off with them. And it didn't really interfere with my studies. But that's, I remained involved with the music scene. And what was kind of fun is a result of meeting members of the band and then knowing people in the local recording industry, because those bands, a lot of them were recording locally. I got to meet some other engineers, some other producers, and from there, I remember I remember one of the bands that I met with the manager was a young group of rock musicians that were hanging out in this little apartment in Brookline, and they just desperately wanted to be rock and roll stars. And I remember hearing them play and thinking, oh, these guys are all right, but I don't know. Yeah. The band was Aerosmith. And I was, I got to be friendly with Stephen Tyler. Well, his name was Stephen Talarico at the time, or Talarico. I knew Stephen, I knew Joe Perry, I knew the former guitarist, Ray Tabato, and they just were like, they were just part of the scene. So I just kept immersed in the whole scene. And so I was able still to continue my love of music by just, it's interesting because when I talk about this, especially when I tell the stories of my kids, it's like, oh, you knew him, and it's kind of like, I never thought much about it. It just was the environment I was around.
What was, you mentioned some of the bands and the whole Boston thing, but what was the scene like? There's always been a ton of college kids in the greater Boston area, Cambridge, Boston, and the surrounding areas. It's one of the things you absolutely need to have a great scene. Was the scene rich in the early 70s when Bruce ultimately starts to go up there? Was it a vibrant scene that could be, compared to some of the other cities like San Francisco, LA, whatever?
The music scene in Boston and Cambridge was incredibly rich and vibrant, and there was a lot of clubs and a lot of music happening. But what was great about it is there was a diversity of music throughout the cities. The first thing, of course, was Boston has that very rich folk history. So you had, in Cambridge, you had Club 47, which later became Passemes. And even when I was in high school, I used to go to Passemes and hear groups like Jim Kweskin Jug Band, the Charles River Valley Boys. I remember seeing the Chambers Brothers in this tiny little place. So that was always a rich scene. But there also was this interesting blues scene that was happening as well. So the clubs that were playing the more electric music were having a lot of the blues bands play. And there was some great bands playing, I remember this group called Roomful of Blues. It was a fantastic band that was local, was doing extremely well. But there just was this real desire for good music and interesting music, and there was some great clubs in Boston in Alston.
Could you name those clubs?
Yeah.
What would have been, say, the top 3 or top 5 best rock clubs in that
Sure.
area around the time when Bruce is happening?
Absolutely. There was, of course, you had, Club 47 in Cambridge. You had a place in Boston called the Unicorn, which had some great acts. Then you had Paul's Mall and the Jazz Workshop on Boylston Street that were interesting because even though they featured mostly jazz artists, as what I would describe as fusion music, like Weather Report, Chick Corea Returned Forever. I mean, I remember seeing Gato Barbieri and Flora Purim in this tiny little room. I mean, it was just a great desire for that music. But one of the things that really was amazing about the city is when this incredible club, the Boston Tea Party, came to be. The Boston Tea Party began literally as an experiment that the radio station WBCN, which was broadcasting from the back of this church on Berkeley Street, decided they would want to also have some live music to broadcast. So they used the front part, which was an old Baptist temple, to bring concerts in. And they were mostly featuring local artists who happened at the time, like the Jay Giles Band, who called it Hallucinations, and some of the other Boston groups that I mentioned earlier. Eventually that became a very popular venue, and around the time that some of the bands that now were with having recording contracts, bands like Led Zeppelin, things like that, they were now coming there and opening the tours a lot. So one of the things that I heard a lot about Boston was not only was it a great place to hear music, but that the fans were very discerning, that they really were very, they could be very critical, but they also could be very welcoming. So a lot of bands would come to Boston and play because they knew there was an audience there really ready to hear some great music.
Right. Another thing about Boston, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you had a good music press up there with the Boston Phoenix and Boston Real.
It was about the Real Paper of the Phoenix, yeah.
Well, those were the two, right? Those were the two most important ones. Any scene, whether it's the Berkeley Barb or the San Francisco Oracle, whatever it might be, LA Free Press, it was always, particularly back then, it was a great opportunity. Most of them were free, and they were able to present articles that you wouldn't get normally in more mainstream newspapers. Now, the magazines were magazines, but these were newspapers that come out primarily once a week. Do you remember anything about the Real Paper or the Phoenix that you might be able to talk about?
Oh, absolutely. The music scene in Boston was not just a rich experience for us who were either college students or lived there, but there was I would say there was a hunger by the local media to capture what was going on there. The first kind of, call it alternative newspaper, actually was called, I think, the Phoenix, which was the Cambridge Phoenix. Its competition was a magazine in Boston called Boston After Dark. And then Boston After Dark went out of business, and the Cambridge Phoenix took over that paper, and then a new paper came out called the Real Paper, which was basically saying we were really the original ones. They were covering all the music. They were not only reviewing the new albums, but they were also covering the scene where you could read about acts in small clubs that you didn't hear about. In a lot of ways, we felt like the Real Paper was like our Rolling Stone, because it was that deep in its coverage, yet it was like, a great paper. And the other thing that I have to mention is the incredible presence of WBCN in Boston, which was one of the first radio stations in the US to really promote what was then true album-oriented rock, and sometimes what would be even called alternative music. It was free form, it was political, the DJs would play what they want, they'd get in trouble for some of the things they say in the air, but it was like such a flashpoint for all things political and musical, and art as well in Boston. I have incredible memories of you could walk up and down Mass Avenue in Cambridge from Central Street to Harvard Square, passing bookstores, record stores, restaurants, coffee shops, everyone playing WBCN out of their speakers.
And it was FM.
It was FM, right.
Progressive FM, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Do you happen to remember the call letter?
104.1. WBCN 104.1. The American Revolution. That's what it was called.
So, John Landau, who obviously would play a very important role because one of the most famous quotes in the history of rock and roll comes out of Boston, comes out of John's brain and into, I can't remember, was it the Real Paper or
the
the
Real
Phoenix?
Paper, right?
It was the Real Paper. So, do you remember? Let's talk a little bit about John. Do you remember reading John Landau? Was he, quote, a name critic up there? And what kind of street cred did he have?
What we knew of John Landau at the time was he was writing for Rolling Stone, which gave a local writer some great credibility because he was also writing for the Real paper. He also, which we were aware of, was very immersed in the music scene because he himself, we knew, really wanted to be a record producer. And if I recall, I think he produced one of the earlier Jay Giles albums, which I don't think it did that well. And he was very frustrated. He was a really bright guy. He was a student of Brandeis, and he was able to bring this kind of great combination of intellectual and emotional journalism to his writings. So he was very well respected, but he was certainly considered a journalist that may bring a little attitude to the review, which is okay because as a critic, you want to hear what somebody has to say about it. The story that I've heard often is, and he was very much a part of the music scene. He would go to the clubs, he would look at things. Everybody kind of knew that he really wanted still to be a record producer, but he was very happy to be doing this. Now, I'm not sure, but I think when he was at Brandeis, I think he eventually left school to go really do most of his writing for Rolling Stone. But the story that I remember was when Bruce's second album, The Wild and the Innocent E Street Shuffle, was released. And Bruce was playing in the Boston-Cambridge area at the time in support of that record, that John had written a review of it. And John, the wannabe producer, mentions about the production quality could have been a little bit better, but I think there's some good raw talent here. Well, apparently one day John is coming to see Bruce play over at Charlie's place, and I think it's one of the nights he might even bring Dave Marsh, Bruce's biographer, who they knew each other very well. And Bruce is at the club, and he's reading the review in the paper, and John, who hadn't met Bruce yet, sees him reading, goes, well, what do you think about that? And Bruce is kind of like, I don't know about this guy. I think he's kind of missed the point of what I'm trying to do here. And so John says, well, I wrote that. And Bruce is kind of like, yeah, but I still think you kind of missed the point here. But what was interesting is John was coming to see Bruce and coming to introduce Bruce's music to Dave Marsh because he knew that there was something here. It was raw, it was untested, it was not formed yet, but he knew there was something special. And again, John really wanted to be a producer, probably in a sense had in his head, how could I make this guy sound really good?
So you, of course, play a part in this story as well. Tell me about the very first time you hear Bruce Springsteen, about him, and be as specific as you can, throw the detail in so that we can more or less recreate the scene in our heads.
I was living in Brookline at the time, which is a suburb of Boston, and I actually was, at this time I graduated Emerson. I finally graduated somewhere, and I actually had become a member of the Emerson Fine Arts faculty. I had started to study photography at Emerson as a student. Even though I was a filmmaking major, I was also studying photography as I was taking a fine art minor. And my eye was getting better and better, and I was enjoying, doing the photography work. But again, my musical interests were still very, very, very important to me. And talking about who was new in the music scene and talking about what music was like was so much a part of our lifestyle then, because we would read about it in the Real paper or hear about it in WBCN. Well, when I was living in Brookline, I had a roommate, and the roommate, who was very much in music as well, came home one day with Bruce's second album, The Wild, the Innocent, E Street Shuffle. And he said,
what was the roommate's name?
Roommate was Lee.
Lee,
Yeah.
okay.
So, you want me to rephrase it?
Yeah.
My roommate Lee brings home Bruce's second album, The Wild, the Innocent, and E Street Shuffle. And he says to me, Barry, I've heard this guy's supposed to be pretty good. Let's check it out. Lee must have heard something about him on the radio at the time. So we listen to the album, we say, yeah, this is good stuff. I've never really heard anything like this before. Right away, we're kind of enjoying the rhymes and the rhythms and the use of the lyrics. There was something really special about it. Well, Bruce had been playing at some of the bars in Boston, Cambridge at the time, and Lee says to me, he's playing over at Charlie's place in Cambridge, why don't we go see him? So Lee, his girlfriend Sandy, and myself go over there one night, and Charlie's place is this little beer garden with sawdust on the floor, high back benches, and a tiny little dance floor. Well, we go into the bar, and the first thing I notice is the band is set up in a corner. I would say in a space maybe 6 feet by 6 feet, tiny. And I look around, and the place is full. I'm thinking to myself, this is strange. Why are there so many people here? I'm just not used to seeing a lot of people hearing a really unknown band. And I comment to Lee, I say, Lee, this place is really crowded. What's going on? And we were jammed in this little booth with 3 people across from us who I didn't know, and one person here's my comment and says, you mean you've never heard this guy before? No, not live, I said. He said, well, you wait. We've been following him up and down the coast. I'm from Philadelphia. I said, okay. So I remember the band coming on and playing the first set, and I remember some of the songs he played, but I remember, like, as soon as the band played, they had this sound that I had never heard before. It was a combination of funk, R&B, jazz, rock. It had more mixtures and textures in it. And he had this style of performance that he was in this tiny space, but he was working the room and working the band as if he was on a giant stage at Madison Square Garden. And it was intense, and it was polished, and it was great. And I remember David Sanchez's drumming and the riffs and all the stuff they were doing. And I walked out to say to myself, I've never heard music like that before in my life. I had this vivid memory of him playing Kitty's Back, and the part where everything gets really quiet, and all of a sudden the band starts going, here she comes, here she comes. And I had this image of Clarence going, here she comes, and they're pointing down the street, and I'm there on the street with them as they're all pointing, here she comes, here she comes. I remember looking around, like, is she here? And all of a sudden, and the band goes back into that break, Kitty's back in town, and I'm sitting going, this is it, I've seen God, this is amazing. I literally go home, I call a friend of mine. Now at the time, I was doing photography for a music promoter in town. The promotion company was called Window Pane Productions. Window Pane Productions was made of 3 individuals.
Stop one second.
Sure.
What month and what year?
This was April of 1974. I was saying, actually, if I could, you want me to bring in a little bit about the, yeah. When I was working at Emerson College and as a photographer, I was always, interested in other opportunities, and as I mentioned, I had this great love for music. There was an individual there who was taking some grad classes whose name was Ira Gold. And Ira and I were talking one time, and Ira said that what he did was he promoted music concerts. And I said, Ira, if you're ever interested in having somebody photograph your concerts, I'd be glad to do it. I mean, I'll just go in there and take the shots. I'll give you some photos. He said, great. So in 1973, I started doing work for Ira Gold and his company, Window Pane Productions. Now, Ira's partner was an individual named Jeffrey Hirsch. And Jeffrey Hirsch at the time was also a manager and worked with Dick Waterman with Avalon Productions that were Bonnie Raitt's manager. So they would do all of Bonnie's shows, and they would also do a lot of other shows with acts that Bonnie worked with a lot. Little Feat, Jackson Browne. And so starting in the spring of '73, I was doing a lot of photography in all the venues with Window Pane Productions and Avalon Productions for all their acts. And basically it was an opportunity for me to have great access to great music and get a chance to photograph them. And what was so nice about that era was there was this intimacy in the relationship between the musicians and the people that were on the stage that weren't the musicians. It was a different sort of environment. I remember coming to one of the sound checks one time for Bonnie Raitt, and I remember like walking on the stage, shooting some pictures, and the band members going, hey, how you doing? Bonnie going, hey, what's new? And I realized that they had gotten to know me after a while, and there was no us and them. We were just all part of the whole thing. So Ira, I worked with Ira quite a while, and so when I came back from seeing the Bruce Springsteen show at Charlie's place, my first thought was, I've got to see this guy again. That's all I thought. I have to see this band again. I was hungry to see this band live again. So I called Ira up and I said, Ira, you've got to put this band on at a show. If anything else, I just have to see him again. So he said, sure. So now Ira had a mindset that he always wanted to occasionally bring on an opening act that was not that well known to basically give a headline act. What's the phrase again? Ira would produce a lot of headline acts, but always wanted to have a lesser known act open up to them. He was very big on giving lesser known acts some exposure. So he took an interest in my suggestion. Ira came by my house. I played him the first 2 albums, Please from Asbury Park and The Wild the Instrument East Street Shuffle, and I really liked it. He says, do you mind if I borrow these records? I want to play them for Jeffrey Hirsch to see if he's interested. My biggest concern at that point was, am I going to see my albums again? Back then, you lent an album to somebody, you may never have seen it again. So Ira called me up a little bit later and says, we're gonna, he actually said, we're gonna book your friend Bruce, is what he says to me. And what Ira said was like, sure. Now, being that they had booked Bonnie for a lot of shows as an opening act, they really wanted to give Bonnie a chance to be the headline act. Boston was her home. They really wanted to give her a chance to be the star. So they had booked 2 shows for her, May 9th, 1974, at the Harvard Square Theater, as a chance to just showcase her.
Was that basically her big coming out as an artist to play a theater?
It was in a sense, because she had, Bonnie at the time had been doing a lot of openings. She had opened for Jackson Browne, she had opened for America, and she really wasn't getting her star status yet. You know, Dick Waterman was working very hard, but being that she was a female blues musician that played slide guitar and played slide guitar very well, she had a great following within the Boston, Cambridge area. Outside of that, nothing really happening yet. So they really wanted to give her a chance to really have her own night.
She doesn't have a deal yet. A record deal? Does she have a record deal?
She has.
Her first album?
Bonnie has done 1 or 2 albums at this time, but
They didn't do much.
They didn't do much at all. So anything they could do to continually promote her was really paramount to her. So they decided that, okay, let's have Bruce open up for this show. Now, what was interesting was the Harvard Square Theater was a small theater. It wasn't a big theater like some of the bigger theaters in Boston that they would do shows in. There was the music hall venue. There was a venue called the Orpheum. It was a small movie theater. And it typically was not used for concerts, but Window Pane Productions had done a Van Morrison show in there a month before, and the owners of the Harvard Square Theater were very hesitant about doing a music show. So because they had success with the Van Morrison show, they were able to use it again for Bonnie's show. And they thought it was the perfect venue for her. Plus they knew they could sell it out as well. So they offered Bruce the opportunity to open for the show, and I think at that point he was just up and down the East Coast, playing a bar here, playing a bar there. There still wasn't a lot of traction with his record labels. Mike Appel knew the best thing he could do was continually get him in front of live audiences, because that's where the popularity was spreading from. So they agreed to book him for the show. Now, somewhere prior to the show happening, what I had heard, what I know, what I learned about prior to the show is that Bruce learned that John Landau was going to be at the second show that night reviewing. Now, he knew that John Landau was still writing for the Real Paper, but he also knew that John Landau was doing much more writing for Rolling Stone at this point. So he knew there was an opportunity to maybe get a little bit more national press than he's gotten in the past. And though I've only heard that story after the fact, what was very evident to me that night, or I should say even from the afternoon, was Bruce really knew that he had a very special opportunity that night and really wanted to do a special show that would be remembered. Because I mentioned earlier that I've gone to a lot of sound checks, and they're very casual. The band plays a few chords, they're sitting down, sounds good, see you later. So Bonnie does her sound check, they play a little bit, they leave. Bruce comes on to do a sound check, and it's a serious rehearsal. And I remember watching him from the side, watching him direct the band. And every time they'd play a few chords, you know, I remember they start doing keys back, there's that little shuffle, they'd stop. They'd point to Clarence, they'd point to Gary Talent, they'd point to Boone Carter. And, he would, and there was this intensity in the way he was directing them, and this equal intensity in the way the band was looking at him, focused. And I thought to myself, this guy's very serious. Not only was I impressed with his professionalism, the way he was rehearsing the band, but he has a mission in mind. So, he does this, there was 2 shows that night, and the first show I think he does about, they told me he has 35 minutes. So the first show he does an hour, and they tell him, you can't do that again. The promoters even go up to Mike Appel and say, he can only do 35 minutes. He can't do that. No problem. Who says no problem? So he comes to the second show,
and you're at both of them.
Yeah, I'm at both of them. And so at the first show, I'm walking around and I'm taking photos from the front and walking the stage. And one of the great things about that time, that era, was there was no big deal about me being on stage shooting. I've looked back at some of my photographs from that night, and I see a video crew there, another photographer there. I see guys hanging out on the amps like this. It just was, we were kind of melded with the band as well. We were all part of this moment, as opposed to this separation between band and audience, band and the members. So he does a really good show, the first set, and I'm thinking this is really cool, you know. So I come back for the second set, and I'm down in front, and all of a sudden the lights get really low, and there's just a red light on Bruce, and there's just a blue light on David Sanchez. And they start playing New York City Serenade.
And this didn't happen during the first show?
No. You know, and I'm thinking to myself, here's a band that's not known to over half of the audience, and he's opening it with a song that's almost classical. I said, first of all, it's a wonderful song. My reaction was, this is incredible. You know, why would anyone do it? The place hushed. And the way he sort of just owned the audience for that moment. He basically, it was planned. He knew what he was doing. And that's, to my point of earlier, it was a way that he sort of knew how to make his shows work. So he went on to, you know, do the rest of his set. And I remember, like, he had this white hat, and he was using the hat like a prop. And the thing that I remembered about the white hat a lot was, it reminded me of the fedora Frank Sinatra would wear. And I was saying to myself, he's from Jersey. This is his little homage to Frank Sinatra. But he used it like a prop. And I remember there was something very theatrical the way he would take it off and move like this, and he was using it in much, like people who work in film, like I've had some experiences, like it's called giving someone some business. And he had that was his business. And then he would tell stories in between. And the people were just laughing, and he was on the audience. And I think everybody was saying, I've never heard anything like this before. So I'm enjoying the second set. And, you know, to the point that I realized, you know, I've been photographing all night. I really want to just enjoy the show now. So I'd say about 3/4 of the way through the second set, I don't know exactly where they were in the set, because I was told they're supposed to do 45 minutes, and we're now at about an hour already. I go on the side of the stage. Again, it's no big deal. I walk up the steps on the side, sit down on the drum case on the edge. I sit down, and I'm thinking, I'm just going to enjoy myself, watch the music now. As soon as I sit down, I see Danny Federici on the other side stand up, Boom Carter stand up, Clarence Walker on the back, Gary Talon unplug his bass, and they're walking off. And I go, great. I finally get to watch the show. The set's over. They all come over to the right as they're walking off stage, and they stop, and they turn around, and they face back. And I remember this distinct image of Gary Talon with his bass up like this, David Sanchez with the 2 drumsticks on his left, he was right next to me, and Bruce comes over and sits down at the piano. And he starts with his fingers stretched out, just sort of playing around. So my first reaction was, well, I'm going to put some film back in my camera. So I'm literally 3 feet away from him. I reload the camera. I start to shoot. And he's playing the song, and I think to myself, I know the song, but this is very different. All of a sudden, I recognize the song is For You. And there was just this moment where I was sort of in the zone. I'm looking through the lens. I'm seeing him. I'm seeing a little bit of light on his face, a little bit of light from him on the side, because in a stage in 1974, in a small venue, there's not a lot of light to work with. But I'm working with what I have. I'm just shooting shot after shot, and I'm listening to it, and the place is just silent. And it's hypnotic. And I remember when he finished the song, and the band, almost as militaristic in their march, walked back to place and sit down. I just, you know, put my camera down, and I was kind of like, wow, I'll never get an experience like that again. And it was just an incredible evening, and I just knew everything about it. And I do remember that I think it was maybe after that song, I'm not sure, that he played some song that was really remarkable. I remember hearing this thing. I don't know this tune. This is an incredible song. But when John Landau wrote his review later on, he talked about this song that featured that Telstar guitar sound. Well, that song was Born to Run. And it was the first time he played Born to Run live. And he knew that John Landau was in the audience, and he wanted him to hear it. And when I heard about that later, I said, that son of a gun. He knows what he's doing. I mean, here was a guy that's living in a motel off and on with his buddies, 2 to 3 to a room, you know, sometimes eating dinner out of the vending machines, literally, and I got to know some people around town that got to know them as they were around town. They just blended into society, but yet when it came to time to make the moment really right for him, he was more than 100% focused as being a professional musician.
Any other opportunities after that that you had to shoot Bruce Springsteen?
There were no, unfortunately, there were no other opportunities after that. You know, I actually moved the following month in June of 1974 to California. And
Where?
I moved to Marin County. And I wanted to move to San Francisco. I had friends that were living in Marin County. I went out there. And what was interesting was, this is a month after the show. I go out there and I'm going, Bruce Springsteen, you gotta hear this guy. He's amazing, the best he's ever had in music. And people are like, never heard of him. And I just couldn't talk him up enough. Now, what was interesting is, since we know that there was a fair amount of time between while the instrument You Shall being released and Born to Run, which I think was August of '75. So I'm out there for over a year talking about this guy that no one's ever heard of, and there's no music even on the radio. Well, when Born to Run was finally released and some tour dates started to appear, one of his tour dates was going to be at the Paramount Theater in Oakland, California. So I was all excited. I went down there the day tickets were available to buy a couple of seats because I wanted to bring some friends. And I remember saying, I gotta get there early. Well, I don't know what time I arrived there, but I was the only one in line. He still hadn't broke there yet, you know? It was just trying to get a little bit of airplay. And I remember like them saying, whatever seat I could have had the front row, but I'm thinking to myself, I don't want to be that close. So I remember picking the 3 rows back, 2 seats in. Now, of course, this was probably a good 3 or 4 months before the concert came. By the time he came, the song had hit. And I remember like the place was packed, yet I had the great seats for it, you know? And it was interesting because years later, I remember, about a year or so later, I remember some friends of mine saying to me, hey, that Bruce Springsteen guy you talked about, he's doing pretty good, isn't he? I said, yeah, he did all right, yeah.
Perfect.
Good.
Good.
Go what you eat.
Awesome.
Great.
Right? Good, right?
Glad to help
Very
out.
nice. Very nice. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Got it. Now, I may have some follow-up questions or
Yeah,
something later
sure.
on, and we'll catch the next time you're down here or something, if there is, because I'll go through this and see,
Yeah.
whatever. But it was very good. You did a
I hope you
really
hooked
nice
that
job.
up. Good.
Really nice job. And for the record, right.
Yeah,
Good, yeah.
good. Well,
All right.
fun for me.
We'll get you a copy too if you want for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
we should do that, so make sure Eileen